Final Fantasy XIV is one of the best MMOs on the market. Players love the story, the Final Fantasy theme park vibes, and the beautiful environments. But when it comes to raiding, is it too stress-free? I'm Frosty, and this is going to be your MogTalk Not-So Daily. In a recent article with the Japanese magazine Famitsu, Final Fantasy XIV's producer and director Naoki Yoshida mentioned that he has some regrets that the game may be becoming too comfortable and not as stressful. He believes games should have elements of stress as it makes the games more enjoyable and helps challenge players. With Final Fantasy XIV, he wants to carefully address it going forward in the Dawntrail. However, Yoshida noted that that doesn't mean that the game's difficulty will be raised, which may be a little confusing to hear, as normally making a game more stressful goes in line with it being more difficult. Later, during a recent Final Fantasy XIV PAX panel, he discussed the topic a bit further. He went over the history of the development of the game and said that during A Realm Reborn, the first expansion which gave the MMO a fresh start, players voiced their desire for the raid content to be more difficult. And developers delivered that in the following expansion in Heavensward. But that was later met with players saying it was too far,
too much,
which caused them to back off on the difficulty. However, later in the panel, Yoshida joked that sometimes he feels sleepy playing the game now, and that some fights may be becoming mundane. So he wants that content to feel less repetitive. He mentioned again that moving forward with Dawntrail, the focus was to create an exciting experience for players. One example was by just reducing the boss's hitbox overall. Yoshida also said that he wants to make the experience more fulfilling and have groups work to find their own strategies. He is encouraging his developers to take risks and is okay making mistakes to try to accomplish this. He doesn't want to fully upset players by making any major job changes, but focus on the content itself and bring back that excitement starting with patches 7.1, 7.2, and 7.3. So what does all this mean? It mostly seems that he wants to see new types of boss mechanics and have a variety of ways to solve them. Doesn't exactly mean that this would be limited to Savage or Ultimate raiding either, although I'm sure it's its core focus. And how do you make changes that don't necessarily make the game more difficult, but create enjoyable stress? Things like just generally reducing the boss's hitbox will create more challenges for tanks and melee players, as it would make the position of the boss more important, as well as creating smaller ranges for hitting rear and flank attacks. Which is really just a simple change that could be applied to all fights across the board. But for groups making their own strategies, that's something for sure that is aimed towards Savage and Ultimate and other high-level content. Luckily, this falls in line well with the new raid plan system they will be adding into the game, as whatever unique methods a group may want to handle can be mapped out and shared with other players joining their party. I will say, however, when it comes to grouping up with random players in Party Finder, it will generally always end up being one strategy. Every once in a while, there'll be a variation, but players generally just crave consistency when they learn fights. Just this tier, the first boss had two strategies to tackle a mechanic, one called Oppo and the other called JP. There was a debate between players joining groups on what the right method was, even though it didn't really matter and was just a preference. But when the players felt they solved the mechanic one way, they didn't want to relearn it again. As the tier went on and JP became more popular, Oppo fizzled out, but not without players who used that strat screaming bloody murder until it was gone from pretty much all Party Finder groups. This may create a fun version of stress that doesn't really make fights more difficult. It just adds more variety when figuring out a solution to the fight. So pre-made parties and statics will have a lot more fun, likely, than Party Finder groups will have with it. But I'd say there's also some concern that making mechanics too flexible with solutions will eventually increase the likelihood of cheesy, brain dead, or some overly easy solutions which ruin the fun of the fight in the end. However, again, Yoshida mentioned that he's willing to take these kinds of risks for the chance of making it a more exciting experience for players. When it comes to what he said about repetitive mechanics, if you've played for a very long time, you'll know exactly what he means. You can only stack and spread and do different versions of numbers on your head, aka limit cuts, so many times before it starts to feel unoriginal. And honestly, this is where it's going to be difficult. Developers are going to be forced out of their comfort zone and have to create a lot of new mechanics we haven't seen before. I have no idea what that could look like. I mean, will they go back to things in Heavensward like controlling robots or making you become an ape, to move a bomb around? Or will it be in line with what we see with tanks being thrown across the arena in the most recent Savage tier? Or will it be something just completely out of nowhere that we haven't even thought of? I do admit it's pretty exciting to think about because it feels like we're going into the unknown. I would venture to say seeing new styles of mechanics technically is stressful, but after we know them, maybe necessarily not more difficult, which falls in line with what Yoshida said. One of the last things he mentions is that he doesn't want to upset too much with the jobs, and will instead just add to whatever is already in place for them. I'm a little bit saddened by this because I would venture to say one of the easiest ways to adjust fun stress and creativity in the whole game is changing the jobs to be more exciting. He does, however, mention that this is because it's at the level 100 milestone and does talk a bit about what to do past level 100. Even though that was mostly in line with what to do about level numbering, I believe we could see some interesting changes to jobs which will go in parallel with that. Likely the boss mechanics will be a big step for 7.x, and we may see major job mechanic changes in 8.x. However, that is pure speculation on my part. And during the end of that panel, I did find it interesting that he mentioned that these changes will start in 7.1.
So, of course, we're going to be focusing on the content itself and the encounters throughout 7.1, 2, and 3 to bring back that sort of excitement.
Which would not include the first Savage raid of the expansion. However, maybe I'm looking too much into it, and him failing to mention 7.0 didn't really mean that much. And that I'm really hoping for. In conclusion, the question really could simply be, is this good for the game to move in this direction? The game gains millions of accounts every single expansion, so they must be doing something right. If they do anything too drastic, it could cause a similar situation that we saw in Heavensward, where people just stopped raiding or they just left the game. Granted, that expansion went pretty deep with the stress, and it was much more difficult as well at the time. However, I can absolutely agree that this is something that needs to be done. My personal bias as someone who plays this game more often than most, and hosts the Final Fantasy XIV World Race, I of course want the excitement to be back in raid design. It would make the game better for me and a lot of players that I know. And honestly, it seems like the goal is really just to create a more stressful environment for veteran players, without adding more stress to non-raiders and new players. The only thing that could really cause any problems behind all of this is if they put a cute mount behind it. In all seriousness, these are just some of my thoughts I have in regards to what Yoshida said about the future of content development going into Final Fantasy XIV. I could go on for hours, but I'd like to hear what you guys have to say about this as well. Please let me know what you think in the comments, and if you want more discussion videos like this, also let me know. Like the channel, subscribe to the channel, and come talk to me on the MogTalk Twitch channel where I raid almost every single day. Have a great day, and remember to be safe, keep cool, and stay frosty.